we'll be talking about a guide that was recently produced in partnership with Packback around adopting an anti-racist discussion in course pedagogy. And we're very excited to be joined today by the three authors of this guide. Today, what we'll be talking about is a bit of an introduction around what you'll hope to find in the guide, what you can expect to find in each section of the downloadable resource that was sent. And then we'll go into panel questions around each of the key topics of the guide. Today, we have three folks who will be doing our panel discussion. So we'll be doing a bit of a conversation back and forth between each of our panelists. I may have some follow-up questions on each topic. And if you as an audience member have follow-up questions as well, please put them into the attendee chat. We have two members of Packback's team in the chat looking through questions that will either be addressing them directly in the chat there or pulling questions from the chat that are directed to the presenters into a queue that we'll address at the end of the conversation. So again, thank you everybody so much for joining us today. And I want to share a little bit about why Packback is involved in this kind of work and why we have worked on producing this guide in conjunction with these three incredible authors who I'll be introducing in just a moment here. So Ishani, would you mind advancing us to the next slide, please? Thank you. So before we jump into any of the content that we had planned today, I think it was something that I really wanted to make sure that we address, and I was talking about with our panelists before this conversation as well, that when we were thinking about why now on this guide, that why now was clear to us as of last week, coming off of a summer where we've seen incredible trauma to Black members of America, both citizens and not. Students in our country have experienced incredible trauma, and we're preparing for a fall semester that is coming on the heels of racial tensions as it relates to police violence, escalating protest violence, and a term that was marred by a lot of change due to COVID. So we're heading into a very difficult semester, and our goal with this guide was to help to provide a resource to make a conversation around building anti-racism into the core of a class pedagogy, and particularly using discussion to help facilitate that conversation. We wanted to make that conversation a bit easier. But for me, there was a new why now as of this week, where we saw yet another unarmed Black man who was injured in an extreme case of police violence at the hands of police earlier this week in Kenosha. Our hearts are with the family of Jacob Blake, who's recovering right now. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up at the beginning of this conversation, aside from continuously acknowledging when these cases happen, is to acknowledge that we're coming off of a summer where there was incredible attention being paid to police and community relationships, and we still had a case like this happen. So the reason that I note that here is I know that not everybody in this conversation may yet be comfortable with these kind of conversations. I know that our team at Packback is still learning a ton and has benefited greatly from the audience, from the authors who have joined us to help produce this guide. We are all learning right now. And I think the importance of bringing this up here is that we still have a long way to go as a community. The fact that a case like this could occur when there is so much attention being paid means that there is still a long way. We have not ended, even though many of us have had our eyes open and have had conversations open this summer to new concepts that we might not have been aware of in the past. That is only the beginning. And our hope with this guide is to continue that conversation and ease the transition into the fall semester. When we worked on building out this guide, we worked with our three co-authors, Dr. Selfa Chew, Dr. Alisa Cooper, and Dr. Akil Houston, who each specialize in building anti-racism into their course pedagogy in different ways. We have specialists in the field of critical race pedagogy, and we have instructors who have built the focus of anti-racism into a class that might not initially focus on racism or on race relations in America. So our goal was to create a panel of authors who have experience that is wide-reaching to help produce a guide that is focused on building anti-racism into any course pedagogy, any discipline or subject matter. And the reason that Packback became involved in this work is our focus as a company is around critical questioning, around supporting student curiosity, and around helping students to ask big and challenging questions of each other and of their class environment. And for us to see what has been happening in our community, which has been happening for a long time, but has absolutely been exposed and come to light and has been a focus of many classrooms this summer. When we think about heading into the fall semester, we felt that it was our responsibility to help create a platform for expert voices to talk about how to bring anti-racism into the discussion and to use discussion as a tool to facilitate further community building in the classroom and to open challenging conversations that instructors may need support from their community on to do that work. So with that, I would love to step into the introductions of our three co-authors. We're joined today by Dr. Akil Houston, who is a filmmaker, a DJ, a social critic. He's one of the nation's leading hip-hop scholars, and he's an associate professor at Ohio University. He teaches in the space of African-American studies and cultural media studies, and is also a member of the National Leadership Board for Hip Hop Congress for the last 11 years. Dr. Houston regularly fills enormous classes at his university from students wanting to learn about cultural media theory and to learn from him in particular. We are also joined by Dr. Selfa Chew. Dr. Chew specializes in critical race theory. She's currently an assistant professor of instruction at University of Texas, El Paso, and she teaches African American studies and history currently. Her research has also covered race relations between the US and Mexico, gender studies, and she embraces a wide-ranging approach to thinking about intersectionality in her race theory in the classroom. So welcome, Dr. Chew. And we're also joined today by Dr. Alisa Cooper, who teaches English and journalism at Glendale Community College, which is a part of the Maricopa Community College system. Alisa specializes in incorporating anti-racist approaches into her class, teaching her students how to structure effective academic rhetorical arguments, how to bring academic resources into difficult conversations, and specifically thinking about how to bring anti-racism into a class that on its surface might not specifically focus on race or culture, but is absolutely a means to having those conversations effectively. So welcome to our three authors. Dr. Houston, I'd love to kick off with you. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what got you interested in becoming involved in this project and what you hope that our audience takes away from this conversation today? And then we'll go down the line with our three authors on that question.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to say thank you for having me. And I appreciate the work that Packback is doing to facilitate these conversations. And I want to say to the authors, my co-authors, I really appreciate learning and reading about your insights. So I thank you, and I'm happy to be a part of the conversation. So one of the things that I thought about in starting this work was, how can we have this conversation on a wider scale? How can we address some of the issues that you opened up with? In fact, the killings of unarmed people continues to happen even as we write these resources. So it's beyond needed. So one of the things that I think as a professor, I'm always thinking about is how can I instill lessons, information that goes beyond the classroom? So part of my job, I feel, is to prepare my students for when they leave my class so that they have a wealth of resources that they can pull on in whatever context that they're in. So that was one of the reasons why I was motivated to be a part of this. And then when I was talking with some of the representatives from Packback, I just thought, wow, this is amazing. I don't know that I've done something like this before and in the way that they wanted to organize it. So I'm again very happy to be a part of the conversation and extremely appreciative of you, Ariam, and some of the other folk that I've had the great privilege, of working with. So I'll try and address some of the other content as we continue. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Houston. We're so grateful to have you here. Dr. Chew, would you mind sharing a bit about your context and what you hope the audience will take away from having you as a part of this conversation?
Sure, and I agree with Dr. Houston. It's been an honor to work with Packback, and I think this is a great project that is providing my students with the tools to become better human beings, better citizens, and residents of the society, and also better scholars. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I expect to generate reflections on issues that are very pressing and relevant. And in a world of information that is quickly spread, there are opportunities for misinformation and for manipulation of data that results in a false view or falsified views of our reality. And so I believe that we as educators need to take the leadership in addressing what is needed to be addressed relation to structural relations of power. And well, here I am trying uh, to create the opportunities for my students to change our reality, which, as you stated at the beginning of this session, is appalling and it's intolerable.
Thank you, Dr. Chew, so much for being here. And I just want to address from the chat, folks are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. If you could move your microphone a little bit closer, or maybe speak into the headphone microphone just for sound.
Okay.
We were all just saying right before we joined this this conversation, we were all praying to the internet gods. Webinars are so stressful for sound and video, and we appreciate everybody bearing with us if we have any tech issues, and very, very grateful to everyone for being here. And Dr. Cooper, I want to hand off to you and share if you have any thoughts around why you joined this project, and what in particular, I think your background is really interesting of working anti-racism into a classroom that's not specifically focused on race. So maybe if you might share a few thoughts around what you hope folks can gain if they don't teach in a class that might make it a really easy entrance to race conversations in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you, and welcome everyone. I was really honored to be invited to participate in this project. I definitely feel it is something that is needed, but I also had to sort of step back and ask myself, why me? Because I don't really specialize in teaching African American studies or cultural studies like the other two authors, but I do have a unique experience and opportunity to share things with my students just because of my background. And so I feel like a lot of students may not have ever had a Black teacher before, and to be able to have a different perspective is interesting. So for me to be able to share with you my experience, is an honor. But basically for me, I wanted to sort of learn from the other authors as well as I was sharing. And so to look and see, oh yeah, I do that, or no, I can add that. That's what's really helpful. And I think many of you will find it helpful as well as you go through the guide and look at that. But we tend to just say that, we're here to teach and we have a job, we have these competencies to meet, and we want to sort of ignore all the other things that are happening in the world. But we sort of have to realize that this opportunity that we have as teachers, it might be the only opportunity that students have to hear discussions around anti-racism. And so we really shouldn't pass on that opportunity, because if we allow for them to remain ignorant in what's going on and conversations that are happening in the world, they're never going to learn. So I just want to make a call for all of you to take up the challenge to don't miss that opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. And again, I know I've said it a few times, but we're very grateful for the three of you and Dr. Glasper, who's joining us in the webinar attendees pool today. He just popped in to say hello to our panelists and our authors right before this. Dr. Rufus Glasper is joining us in the audience. He contributed a foreword to the piece. Dr. Glasper is currently the CEO and president of League for Innovation in the Community College, and was prior to that the chancellor of the Maricopa system. So we're very honored to have Dr. Glasper's attendance here and his contribution to the forward as well. So thank you all. We truly, truly could not have done it without you, and we've learned a great deal from this process. And Ishani, with that, would you mind advancing us to the next slide? So in preparation for this session, we met last week, the panelists today and myself, to talk about what we wanted to really cover on this webinar. And one thing that came up very heavily in our conversation was the notion of all the articles that have come out recently around diversity training not working, or diversity training on campus being likely to disappoint. We've got two examples shared here, one from 2012, if you can see, and one from 2020. So that kind of counter conversation has been very prevalent in these conversations around working anti-racism and inclusivity into the classroom. And I wanted to hand it over to Dr. Houston, because I thought you had some particularly interesting points around how do we think about what we're doing here with this guide and with the semester ahead in the context of concerns around if this kind of training really works.
Thank you. So one of the challenges, I think, to this kind of work is we have things that we do on campus, and that's framed by, well, this is how we do it. This is the way to do it, and we'll let such and so take care of it. And so I think when you do it that way, the way that it's always been done, you end up with articles like this, And I think you also have to recognize that there are some who will automatically pivot away from conversations like this. So I think one of the challenges with being on campus is to sort of embrace the idea of diversity and inequality, which is the title of a new book that looks at some of these issues at the University of Michigan. And I think we have given lip service to these topics, and maybe we put some money into a DEI department, but we haven't done anything to truly change the structure of how campuses operate and how we interact with each other on a day-to-day. So inevitably, it leads to, okay, we've just allocated however millions of dollars to a new DEI space. We have a new chief administrator who's going to answer directly to the president, and this is going to solve all of our problems on campus. And in many ways, it just creates more problems because there hasn't been any real interest in changing the culture of the campus. So it becomes a lot like, student events. There's a new flyer, there's a new room to go to, you go to it, and the cycle repeats. So I think with this guide, there are some practical things that speak to facilitators, instructors, professors, staff who can do things on a day-to-day basis. Sort of paraphrasing Gloria Steinem, it's the everyday little radical acts that make the biggest impact. So rather than looking at, well, let's come in and redesign the whole DEI office, let's appoint 2-3 more people, let's bring in a couple of speakers at $20,000 a pop, I think it's the small things. So how am I creating a more inclusive space for my students? How can I recognize that all of my students bring in diversity? And some of those diversities that they have are not visible. So, what about my students who are differently abled? What about my students who identify differently based on how we understand gender these days? So what am I doing as an instructor, as a professor, as a staff member to ensure that I'm meeting the needs of my students? And these kinds of questions can't be done by, well, this is how we do it. So I think one of the challenges is that we have to begin to rethink the process. We have to begin to rethink how we talk about these things, and in doing that, move differently in the world. There's a great book on relationships. It's called To Dance with Anger. And it's about couples, but I think it applies here. And one of the examples the author uses is that, if you're in the same argument with your partner, maybe instead of expecting them to be different, you move differently. You begin to have different questions. You move in a way that you don't respond to the same things that are trigger points. And like a dance, if you begin to shift your movements, your partner is going to have to respond differently. So I think in many ways, when we talk about anti-racism, anti-Blacknesses, we have to shift differently. We can't do the same dance. And I think this guide is an introduction to how we can move differently, how we can think differently, and ultimately, as Dr. Chew said earlier, how we can be better human beings.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Houston. And I think that's a great transition to our first topic that we're going to be covering today in more depth from the guide. And honestly, one of the biggest eye-openers for me, and how our three authors all separately, when we were working on this guide across different interviews and across separate conversations, all three came to this conclusion that I thought was beautifully articulated, and I learned a lot from, around the notion of self-reflection as the instructor. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces that might be surprising to someone downloading this guide, is that a huge chunk of this guide is around what do we need to ask ourselves as folks who want to do this kind of work before we ever engage in the work. We certainly have also included some practical tools and downloadable resources to make the transition easier. But a big focus of the guide is around what self-reflection needs to occur first. And I think what you just hit on there of how do we move our own movements to better react to our partners and to the goal that we want to have in our classroom, a lot of that work happens before any words ever leave our mouth to anyone externally. So with that, Ishani, would you mind advancing us into the next section, which is preparing yourself as an instructor? So I'm going to give a quick overview of what you can expect to find in the guide on this, and then we'll move into panel questions here. This first section of the guide contains just a foundational overview of the importance and the history of anti-racist pedagogy. By no means a comprehensive overview. This is very much an introductory guide that we are that we're using as a tool to get started on this kind of work. We've included at the very end of the guide some extended resources and readings that were recommended by our authors as well to continue the conversation. But in this first section, you'll find that foundational overview. You'll also find some structured self-reflection questions, kind of open-ended discussion questions to be self-reflected on by the individual instructor around what should we ask ourselves, or what should instructors ask themselves before adopting this kind of teaching method. And something that Dr. Houston said to me when we were first starting this process was, are you all really ready for doing this work? Are you ready for the kind of questions that will come? And I think that that's a question that must be self-reflected on before we share and expect others to reflect with us. So there's some great questions in there that help to think about what situations should you mentally prepare for, and what situations should you tactically prepare for, what reading should be done ahead of time, or what foundation should exist. So I hope that those questions are very helpful as you're getting started on this work this semester. And then we included a couple of common scenarios to expect and to think about how you would deal with them. Not a prescription for how to deal with them, but just some common scenarios that you may want to self-reflect on, to think about, if this happens, I want to have that reaction in my back pocket. You know, chance favors a prepared mind. Being able to react from a place of calm preparedness as opposed to being caught off guard can be very helpful in these kinds of high tension conversations. So with that, we'll continue on to the panel question for this section, if you don't mind advancing us, Ishani. So the first question we wanted to ask here is, what questions should instructors personally reflect on before embarking on the work of anti-racism in their classroom? And feel free to diverge from this question and also ask each other questions in follow-up. I'll nudge us along in certain directions, but I really want y'all to take it away. Dr. Chew, would you mind starting?
Right. I think one of the questions that I ask myself constantly is, what is the relation of power, racial power, that I represent in the classroom? What are my privileges and biases, the obstacles that I have had to face in order to be here, or the privileges that I have enjoyed in order also to be leading this discussion in the classroom. Do I know my students? Do I know their languages, their cultures, their aspirations? But I think the most important is, am I prepared to acknowledge my own mistakes, my own perceptions, my place in society? Am I prepared to be questioned about my role in the classroom and the society at large? So those are the questions that I constantly ask myself before I start every single course.
Thank you, Dr. Chew. And I think, Dr. Cooper, I remember you saying something similar when we were first having this conversation too, around the role that the instructor plays in the classroom, and how that role holds a lot of weight, particularly in discussion. Would you mind sharing some of your thoughts that you had shared with us about that role of the instructor in the discussion and in facilitating student conversation?
Yeah, I think when you try to have conversations like this with your students, that the key thing is that your students understand that your role is not to have all the answers and not to be the rule keeper, and allowing for students the freedom to be able to discuss whatever the topic is that you may be talking about. So I feel like just sort of setting the stage for what you anticipate to happen, and then letting students know ahead of time or what your expectations are. Because a lot of times students will just look to you to answer all the questions and have all the answers. But I also feel like you have to sort of let students know a little bit about yourself as well. I mean, not necessarily personal, but how can you relate to their experiences? You have to tell them what your experiences are. And if your experiences are different, it's even wise to share that with students. Just by simply saying, well, I'm Black and you're white, and my experiences are different in these ways. You don't have to make assumptions about why they are different. Just because I'm Black doesn't mean that I was raised in any particular way. And so I think just by sharing that with students and letting them know that the goal around this discussion is for others to understand their point of view and where they're coming from. And so the instructor, I'm not here to say, no, that's wrong, or yes, keep going with that. That's great.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, Dr. Chew, you had shared some examples of situations that you prepared for, that you kind of know going into the classroom, that questions that students may have around what they'll be learning in the class and around your relationship to the subject matter and your background. When you're thinking about the situations that someone should prepare for in advance and kind of get themselves ready to anticipate and deal with, what are some of the things that come to mind for both of you that someone should be ready and expect that this tough situation may occur, and how I want to deal with that?
My presence in an African American history course is questioned right away because I am a Chinese Mexican indigenous person, and so students ask, "Why are you here? What do you have to teach us about the African American experience?" And so before they ask that question, I address it immediately. And of course, I disclose my relationship to the material in the course, but I always state that I have chosen at least 30 African American scholars who are going to be the educators, the scholars who they are going to learn from, and that I am there only to facilitate this communication between the students and those who are experts in the field. My accent also, right away, the students are taken aback by my accent, and I address it also, and I explain the historical development of different languages and different accents, and why I am qualified to share with them my my knowledge and to learn with them. So those are two different aspects of my life that I share with them, so we can uh, just overcome those barriers and just focus on the content of the course.
Thank you, Dr. Chew. And I know that those situations will be different for every instructor, where your background will overlap with the subject matter that's being taught and the historical context that we're existing in right now and the school that we're at and the students' backgrounds. So we can't predict those situations. But I think thinking about those situations ahead of time of what should I expect to happen and then how would I answer that can be really helpful. And Dr. Houston, saw your video feed came back. Would you mind sharing with us some of your questions that you ask yourself or you encourage other educators to ask themselves before they start on this work?
I always like to think of what is it that I'm asking my students, and am I prepared to do the same thing? We want them to be transformed by the learning, but am I willing to be transformed by the learning as well? And I think this is some the other panelists alluded to, that you don't have to be the person with all of the answers. So I kind of think of myself as more of the guide on the side. So, I ask myself, what does it mean to really unpack these ideas? And before I even get to the class, I have thought about, how does my positionality impact what I see, what I don't see? And so, is my syllabus, for example, does it reflect the kind of diversity that I'm talking about? Have I matched my actions and words? So, one of the things that I do is I say, okay, have I looked at different voices on this subject? Have I only privileged things that I like? And I think those are always tough questions. And I think those tough questions are what help us to become better educators and better facilitators for this kind of conversation. So I really think that having these internal questions before you get to the students is helpful. And in many ways, it can prepare you for what may happen in the classroom, which is always exciting because you don't know what your students are going to say. You don't know, at least on the first day, where they're coming from, ideologically speaking. So it's always exciting to hear how students are processing. But I think before you get to that point, if you've played that game with yourself, okay, there's going to be a number of questions based on the fact that I'm raising this. What about the students who are ultra conservative, who are just completely closed to learning this? How will I talk to them? And then how is it that I'm going to facilitate this conversation without necessarily overly focusing on those voices in the classroom. So it's interesting, and I think it's specific to us as individuals because we all bring in different positionalities. So, are you firstborn? Do you come from a small family, a large family? Are you heterosexual? Are you transgender? Are you a woman? Are you a man? How do you see yourself? Because one of the things I think I work against is the assumption that because I'm Black, all of this is personal. All of this is opinion. And so what that means for me is that a lot of times some students don't understand that, yeah, I do have real world experience, but I'm also a scholar. This is also my disciplinary focus. So I'm not just up here telling you anecdotes. I'm giving you information that's based on my expertise. So some people can walk into a room and stand up front and never be questioned. Whereas with me, there's always this sort of conversation with some of my students that, well, this is just his opinion. This can't really be true. So I think being prepared to deal with that and not necessarily respond from an emotional place, but be able to respond in a way that makes the conversation accessible and then honors you as an instructor. So these are kind of things that I think is important to think about and work through before even getting to the point of talking with students.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Houston. And I think that's a great transition into the next section, which is around preparing students. And there was a question that just came up in the chat from Carol Higham, who was asking about her experience as a white instructor talking about race. And this reminds me a lot of Dr. Chew's experience talking about, how does she get ahead of sharing with her students why this conversation needs to happen and why the race of the instructor plays a role, but does not preclude that conversation from happening between a white instructor and a student body. So Dr. Higham, I feel like it sits somewhere between the first section and the second section around that. So were there any comments from any of our panelists around self-preparation before we get into preparing the students with kind of getting ahead of some of those elephants in the room that we might want to address before we dig into the meat of an anti-racist discussion with the classroom? Were there any comments on the self-preparation side before we move on to help address that question?
I'm looking at the chat, and I think, I always make the assumption that I'm sexist. Despite the fact that I actively teach feminist, womanist, Africana, womanist theory, I always say I'm a man. I've been socialized in the West, and the way in which I've been socialized is to be sexist. So I don't have hurt feelings about that. It's a function of how I was socialized. So I think one of the challenges in terms of self-preparation is that we envision ourselves to be really good people. And to hear words like sexist or racist, homophobic, that challenges that notion. But I think if we're willing to unpack, well, why am I sexist? And begin to explore that, that helps because your students are going to go through the same thing. And they may or may not have the sophisticated language and theory to unpack it. But I think it's a necessary first step. And it's difficult because it goes against how we may see ourselves. So maybe based on my experience in African American studies and in teaching courses that relate to feminist issues, I think that I'm very progressive. But nobody knows that. What they see is on the exterior. And based on their experiences with other men, other heterosexual men, whatever the case may be, there are things that they say, oh, wow, well, he's X, Y, and Z. So if I'm already having that conversation with myself and making the assumption that, yes, I am sexist. However, I don't have to stop there. I can begin to actively do things that will dismantle that. Now, in a perfect magical world, I could just say, I'm not sexist and I've moved away from that. But the reality is, that's part of the socialization process here in the West, here in the United States. So it means that I have to consistently, in small everyday acts, challenge a lot of the assumptions based on gender. And that means I have to be willing to work on those contradictions in myself. So I think preparing yourself for those difficult conversations and having them is great because you're going to be the person who's facilitating that for the students. And I think the more sincere, serious, and committed you are about that, the more likely students will embrace the journey. Even those students who may be really resistant initially.
Thank you. Were there any other comments just building on Akil's points there before we move on to the section around preparing students? I think that was incredibly helpful. And I saw Carol also added a follow-up comment in there. So thank you for adding that. And Carol will continue to address that in the next section here. Ishani, would you mind advancing us to the next slide? So I'm going to be quick here, but I wanted to share in this section of the guide, we've provided, from the author's words, 3 key actions to help set up a class to have productive conversations around race. Probably the most important is explaining that why. Why is this conversation relevant to any subject, to any class? Why is this relevant in our society? Why at this moment? Why are we talking about this in a class that someone might not have signed up to explicitly talk about race relations and inclusivity and anti-racism? So that explaining that why. Setting an example of vulnerability, which I think all 3 of our panelists have touched on so far today, of thinking about putting ourselves in the most uncomfortable positions to start, and establishing a set of communication guidelines for the class, which can kind of act as a cheat sheet to come back to if the conversation starts to steer off. And the guide provides a recommended communication guideline template that can be used in the classroom. So by no means is this the only way to set expectations around communication. It is one way to think about that, to have referenceable materials to point back to make sure that those communication guidelines are explicit and clear, and that transgressions of those guidelines have clarity around how they will be handled. So we hope that resource is helpful, but if you'd feel more comfortable to build your own, the goal is really around thinking about how do we make those communication expectations explicit in the classroom. So with that, I'd love to move to the question for the panelists. If you could flip us to the next slide. So wanted to ask all 3 of you, how do you each establish early expectations to your class to help prepare students to have meaningful conversations around race and around anti-racism? And Dr. Cooper, I know you do some really interesting stuff with your class around this. Would you mind giving us the first answer here?
Yeah, sure. So I teach argumentative writing to freshman students at the community college. And so, students, before we even have discussions like this, students are learning a lot of the different argumentative skills that are necessary to be able to write that type of paper. So when we do go or move to the discussion portion where we talk about some different topics, and it's not always just anti-racism topics. There are a lot of different topics that we use, and some of them get really heated. I mean, in the past couple of years, before it was legalized, the whole gay marriage issue always just brought up lots of angst and anger and religion in these discussions. So I think one of the things that I do before we even start to have these conversations is that I explain to students that we all have different perspectives. We've talked about that, and we all have different beliefs and the things that we find important, and that the goal for these discussions, so you have to have a goal, but the goal for these discussions is for us to understand the other person's perspective. So our goal is not to win the argument or for everyone to hear us. We have to express our perspective on the topic, but your goal is to be understanding, to see where they've come from and why they believe what they believe, and then to be able to explain that. So every time we then have a discussion, I just have to remind students, though, it's not about you. Why? What is their perspective? Why do they feel that way? What's their, what are they bringing to the table that lends to that view that they might have? And then also reminding students what the purpose of in argument, and that is to use facts to support whatever your claims are. And by reminding students of that, it tends to make the discussions go a little bit better.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cooper. And I know, Dr. Chew, you do something similar in your classroom to help focus students towards the learning from the conversation as opposed to it being adversarial or controversial to them. Could you talk a little bit about those expectations you set to your class?
Right. I ask my students to keep an eye on horizontality. We have to intervene on equal basis, right? We need to take our turns. This is not a contest. I agree with Dr. Cooper. We are not here to win anything because because this is the nature of knowledge. We create knowledge, we transform knowledge, and it's never set in stone. So these are only points that we need to in, keep reflecting on, and most likely we are going to transform the terms of our participation in those conversations as we research, as we reflect, as we compare reality to the information that we gather in our class materials or discussions. So we are going to change our perspectives, and we're going to be very embarrassed later if we yelled and screamed and wanted to get the prize of the debate in our past, right? So this is one of the expectations of the class that I established early in the term. Another expectation is language. It's not to censor, but to learn how we approach our social reality through new language. As Dr. Houston stated before, we were educated in a way that we are still performing sexism and racism and elitism, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the tools to educate us is language. And so we need to find new language in order to start transforming that reality or critiquing that reality. And so I explain my students that any term is problematic, but that we need to start thinking about what are the terms, what are the words that have been hurtful to certain communities. And so how do we want to use them or to avoid them in our conversations? So those are expectations. And the third one is also, as Dr. Cooper stated, to develop a method of argumentation that is based on data, facts, information. That we are here to change, we are here to transform, but that we need to base our discussions on, so we don't go in circles. So every time the discussion is not being fruitful, I ask my students to go back to the material, to analyze how an argument was built in the text that I assigned for them to read and to critique it, because maybe it is faulty too. And the language may be also not the best. And so they can go back always to the material, to the content, to the structure of that material.
Yeah, I think that is a really helpful reference to just keep pulling students back to the text. What are you seeing in the text? What are the scholars teaching us about this? To take it out of the realm of opinion and personal hurt or personal offense and back into the realm of scholarship. And Dr. Houston, I know that you use a mantra in your classroom to help keep students in that learning mindset. Would you mind sharing your background of learning to incorporate that into the class and how that's helped you?
Sure. So Peggy McIntosh often uses this. It's not about shame, blame, or guilt. And so one of the things that I start at the outset with is that that's not what we're here for. We're not here to blame anybody. And I repeat it, and I encourage my students to repeat it, to remind themselves that it's not about shame, blame, or guilt. You know, ultimately what happens is students become stuck. People become stuck. It's not just students. And so you can't move out of one of those areas. And unfortunately, when you're stuck there, it doesn't allow for any real meaningful engagement to come with some of the other pieces of the conversation. So I may err on the side of caution in that I ensure that that's what my students know, and that's something that we try to practice. But I think, many students, particularly students who are taking courses in African American studies for the first time, already come with preconceived notions. Oh, this is about beat up on white people, or we're going to just talk about slavery and how bad everything is for Black folks. So you have to unpack a lot of that first before you can actually get into more of the substantive commentary. And, I think early on in my teaching career, I thought, if I just overwhelm them with details, with facts, with data, that they'll get it. But a lot of times people are invested in a lot of the emotional aspects of these conversations, and they're unable to get out of their own way. And even faculty members, one of the things that I hear often is, well, that's not my wheelhouse. I don't feel comfortable. I don't really know enough about that. And so we end up not talking about it at all. And that's worse, in my opinion. We have an opportunity, and it's an opportunity regardless of what we're teaching that we need to take if we're sincere about preparing students for the rest of the world, because the way in which people experience racism, it's not going to come in a nice, neat bundle. It's going to come out in the way that the world kind of experiences and engages with it. So we need to be adept at handling this. And so I think establishing early that this is something we're going to face. This is something you're going to face and may have already. And I think it was it Bishop Desmond Tutu who said you can't be neutral on a moving train. Maybe it was Howard Zinn, one of those. But I think the point is we can't afford to not have these conversations. And so really preparing students for the long haul is part of, establishing, the expectation at the outset of the course.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent transition also into how discussion can play a role in that. When we are having these conversations, what do we need students to be thinking about? What should the terms on which we discuss be to lead to the best outcomes? Ishani, would you mind advancing us to the next section? So I'm going to just quickly glance on here to help folks get started with these kind of conversations. Obviously, Packback focuses very much on student-led discussion and on student inquiry. And as I'm sure our panelists will share as well, I think that's been very valuable in these kinds of conversations as well, to get students asking their own questions and reflecting. The guide does provide some starter prompts. While that's not typical for the way that Packback typically does discussion, if you're looking for a way to get these conversations started and not quite sure how to get the train moving, as Akil said, we included some prompts in there with explanations of why these prompts are useful. And a set of explanations around how student-led discussion can help as a tool for anti-racism in a classroom, particularly around the notion of getting students to reflect. So with that, I'd love to progress to the panel question. Ishani, if you wouldn't mind advancing us. So kind of either one of these questions that you feel best addressing. Our goal here is asking what role you each believe that discussion plays in anti-racism in the classroom, and what role the instructor should play in that discussion. Dr. Chew, would you mind starting us off?
Right. Discussions are paramount in teaching any subject, but introducing this theme it requires discussion, because we also need to address the role of feelings in attaining knowledge and achieving a reflective state that is going to help us transform a reality. And so discussion is very important also to express personal narratives that are going to allow the class to assess the relevance of other communities, other individuals, particular experiences. And I like putting ourselves in the shoes of others is not going to happen in the abstract. We know the person that is talking about their route in life, then we are going to be more keen to listen and to imagine what we would do or how we would face that situation, or what would we do to transform the situation. So discussions are very important. Also, I think that reminding our students that academic discussions are very important to form them as scholars, as researchers, as professionals is part of my responsibility as an educator. And so the discussion need to be structured in in a way in which they form part of our curricula, our objectives as a university, right? So that's why I try to foster discussions in my class, whether the virtual classroom or the face-to-face situations. And so as an instructor, my role in that type of discussions is to facilitate, to listen, more than anything, to listen, to provide the appropriate materials that are going to result in a productive conversation, in reflection, and also to remind the students of the relevance at a personal level, social level, and also professional level.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chew. And it reminds us something that Dr. Cooper said when preparing the guide, that written reflection in particular helps students take ideas out of the realm of concept and into the realm of the concrete so they can be criticized. And that really moved me when you said that. I thought that was a beautiful way to phrase why the writing matters so much. Take it out of the realm of emotion and into the realm of the concrete. Dr. Cooper, would you mind just expanding on that a bit, and especially on how you use it in your classroom and how it could be used in other classes that similarly touch race but do not focus on race as the core of the subject matter?
Well, I think one of the things that many of us try to do when we want to address things like this is we try to add different elements to our curriculum, like readings or even videos. And then we expect that students will read those readings and watch those videos, and then all of a sudden get what it is that you were trying to get with that. And it has to go beyond that. And so luckily for me, I do teach a subject matter where students are required to write. But I also feel that it's more than a matter of just saying, hey, read this article written by this Black person because it's going to enlighten you. And I think what has to happen next is to have a discussion around that. Like, why did you want them to read that? Did you just want them to read it because you're trying to diversify your curriculum? Or was there a message that you really felt that students needed to hear? And they're not going to always get it. So you have to wrap that around discussion and also around writing and letting them reflect. So a lot of the writing in some courses is very formal, but giving students the opportunity, and especially now that we're in an online environment, your discussions are actually writing assignments. But giving students an opportunity to be able to reflect on what their perspective or what it is that they got out of a particular writing or a video that you had them watch. And I think that's really important because a lot of this stuff will go right over their heads when they're asked to just read something. And so being able to say, what did you think about, when Brian said this? And a lot of students will be like, well, I didn't think anything. And so one or two will pipe up and they're learning from each other in these scenarios. So I feel that discussion is really important. And now that we are thinking about adding the addition of these anti-racist discussions, I think it's going to be better for students.
Yeah. And Dr. Houston, I know that you've focused in particular on student-led discussion in your classroom. Would you mind just talking about what led you to that conclusion? Why did you think about focusing it more on students talking to each other rather than being more instructor-led in the classroom?
I think that students are some of the best teachers. So if we can get out of the way sometimes and allow them the opportunity to talk with each other and to push each other, you'd be surprised. So some students who may not speak doesn't mean they're not listening. And there are students who feel more comfort in smaller groups. So I try to incorporate small group exercises and really privilege their voices. So much of education is talking at students.
We'll give Dr. Houston just a second to rejoin here. As he was just mentioning, there are small groups. While we still have Nathan Parker in the audience here, I know there was just an awesome conversation that happened in the chat around how to make these conversations more approachable, especially in the hyper-polarized environment that we're in right now. I believe that was Usami that asked that question. And then Nathan responded back and said, small groups can be really helpful. And I think that's a great insight of getting students into a smaller group that feels a little bit safer, where those kind of conversations can be a little bit more free. And I believe Dr. Houston was just expanding on that thought. So hopefully he's able to rejoin on video. But for now, we'll move on to the next section and then come back if there's any final comments from Dr. Houston on this point. So our fourth section of the guide is around more holistically thinking about how to design an anti-racist course, looking at course materials, kind of investigating your course materials list for representation, being aware of bias and feedback and evaluation. And I wanted to put a gigantic asterisk on this bullet point here of this is a whole field in and of itself, and our guide has a paragraph in it about this topic. So this guide should not be taken as the whole comprehensive takeaway for that, but more a starting point for hopefully digging into a deeper dive on the role of bias in evaluations and how we can really question our evaluations' efficacy and equity. That section also includes a set of practical resources. We included a downloadable syllabus statement in there that can help, if you're comfortable putting it into your syllabus, it speaks to why anti-racism is being brought into the classroom. A reading list that can help instructors and students extend sort of the foundational anti-racist reading list to get you started. And a downloadable communication expectations page. So that same thing I mentioned in section 2, we have that as a downloadable if you'd like to attach that or share that or make it as if you are face-to-face this semester, have it as a physical resource in the classroom as well. So hopefully these resources are helpful. And again, they're just a starting point. But I'd love to dig into our final question here in our last few minutes on our webinar together. And I know there are some amazing questions in the chat, which we will actually be copying out. I will work with our team and with our panelists here to make sure that if there are any open questions that we get them answered in the follow-up email from this webinar as well. So if we've missed anything, just know that we'll be following up by email shortly afterwards. So I wanted to end here on a question really of how has your approach to building an anti-racist classroom evolved over time? And particularly, what do you hope that folks take away from this conversation as they head into what is likely to be a very difficult semester? How would you kind of prepare our audience members to be ready for that term and be ready for the future beyond this upcoming fall? So Dr. Houston, do you mind giving us your answer to start?
Sure. I think I got disconnected. But I think over time, I have moved more towards some of what has already been discussed by Dr. Cooper. And, not being, I know all the information or I have access to all the information. I think I've moved more toward student-centered discussions and then finding moments where I can kind of insert into the natural flow of the conversation, here's some literature, here's some research. This is what the data says, instead of, beating them over the head with all of that information up front. So I think that over time it's been, how do I, and I think Dr. Chew mentioned this earlier, how do I engage feelings? So much of what's going on is experience, it's felt. A lot of what's happening in terms of what's going on in the country, it's a visceral feeling. And so a lot of this stuff is not common sense, although some would argue common sense is not that common. It's visceral, it's emotion. So if we can tap into that and really understand how we can reach people there, that's where I've leaned more so in my teaching over time, and really being influenced by books by scholars who talk about the importance of understanding emotions. I think Brene Brown has become really popular in looking at her work and research on vulnerability. And I think I've taken a page out of that research and thinking about, well, how do we get beyond the ego? How do we get beyond, well, this is what my parents do, so that has to be right, and you're asking me to change. I think that has been where I see my pedagogy changing over time. And there was a really great question about openly racist commentary in the chat. Looks like my former teaching assistant. So That to me has been something that has evolved as well. I think I spent a lot of time wanting to, like I said before, give them information and sort of overwhelm them with data. So that doesn't always work. A lot of times students go in the opposite direction. So I think what I've attempted to do is to give them the space to learn, engage the material, and be challenged by their peers, be challenged by their classmates. And then sometimes they circle back to the literature and they're more open. So I think, focusing less on the expertise and more on the experience and inviting them into the conversation. And then, quite frankly, sometimes, and this I think is based on a personality, I challenge some of the assumptions. So it's like, well, what does it mean to think differently? Or a question that I've become very used to asking is, well, what would it mean that, women, for example, know their experience better than you? Not saying that they do, but what if they did? And sometimes if you phrase it in that way, it at least gets someone open to, well, wow, I never thought about that. Even though it seems very common sense that a woman would know what her life is like on a day to day versus someone else. But sometimes, we're so invested in being right that we're not thinking about, does this make sense? So I think having those moments to pause, to reflect, and also to have the students engage with each other and discuss with each other, like Packback offers. I think that's one of the benefits and how I've sort of evolved over time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Houston. And Dr. Chew, do you mind leaving us with your one key takeaway for the audience on what they can think about of how their approach to anti-racism may evolve over time, what they can expect this upcoming term?
Well, again, I think that knowledge is a collective endeavor, and so group discussions are very important for that reason. I learn from my students. I am surprised by them, from their perspectives, their questions, and their critiques of each other's ideas and the scholars that we visit. So definitely, we need to also air every idea possible in our classroom, because as Dr. Cooper stated, if we don't facilitate this type of forum, then in isolation, they are going um, to stay on their knowledge and their engagement with the issues in our society that need to be changed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dr. Chew, that this moment of having students in the classroom may be one of the last best opportunities to start the conversation. It certainly doesn't end it, but it's one of the last best first places to have these conversations get started if it hasn't happened for them before that moment. And Dr. Cooper, would you mind leaving us on kind of your key takeaway for the audience around their upcoming semester and what they can expect?
Well, if you're going to engage students in these types of discussions, you really want to focus on listening skills, because that's where the real learning happens, is teaching students how to listen to each other. Everybody wants to talk, but is anyone actually listening? So that would just be my key takeaway, is to try it. Don't be afraid of it. To speak with your colleagues about how to approach it, but then teach the listening skills. And good luck.
Dr. Cooper, Dr. Chew, Dr. Houston, thank you again so much. It has absolutely been an honor to get to work with you three on this project. We're very, very grateful that you joined us for this webinar today as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention here, just on this slide, this again is a starting point for this kind of conversation, for this kind of work. We are extremely excited to hear feedback from folks who use this in the classroom this upcoming semester, ideas for how we can make it better, make it more comprehensive, opportunities where we may have an opportunity to go deeper into one of the areas in the guide, or change something if we got it wrong. And I think that our goal is to try to embody the same tip that we recommend in the guide of continuously iterating based on new learnings. So please don't hesitate to share where you think that we may be able to tweak this guide and make it better for the future. Our goal is for the long term, not just for this one term. So thank you again so much for being here. My email is jessica@packback.co if you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas to share and follow up. And as I said, I'll be grabbing the chat from everyone who was in attendance making sure that those questions get answered in follow-up. Again, thank you to our panelists for being here. It's really been an honor.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you again.